This podcast may mention instances of domestic violence, which may be disturbing or triggering to some listeners. The discussion may include descriptions of sexual, physical, and/or verbal abuse that can have serious and long-lasting impacts on individuals who have experienced such trauma. We make no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this podcast. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only. This podcast should not be considered professional advice.
Hi, I'm Tara Woodley, and I'm happy to welcome you to our podcast today, Through the Eyes of Survivors by Break the Silence Against Domestic Violence, where we are trying to shatter the myth of domestic violence and intimate partner abuse. So many of us survivors, like myself, have a long road of healing ahead. And many of the victims, it takes a lot of inner strength to overcome their past abuse. And in order to be successful in that, many of us have to have people around us who can encourage us, hold us accountable. And a lot of times it's hard to restore that balance and walk away, from things that are extremely abusive. So we, as survivors, a lot of times have to attend counseling or life coaching or a combination of those things in order to create healthy boundaries, in order to remain safe and prevent us from repeating those actions, right, that we fell into when we were in this abusive relationship to start. So today's topic, we're going to talk about the available resources, because sometimes they can be a little confusing as to what kind of resource or treatment might be right for you as a survivor. And we're going to help sort out those differences. Today's very special guest here with me today is Deanna Ward. Deanna is not only a board member here at BTSADV, she's very important, with her line of work, because she's a licensed marriage and family therapist. And Deanna helps her clients with EMDR therapy as well. Also, we have Maury Danielle. Is that correct? Yes. Maury is an author and a speaker and a life coach and a survivor advocate. She's founded an organization called Be Free to Fly International. And her story is about overcoming and life-altering trauma that carries an inspirational message to our audiences. And then lastly, we have Midori Davison, who is our chairwoman of the board of directors here at Break the Silence. And she is a strong advocate and survivor that we just depend upon in this organization so much. So, ladies, we're going to begin our topic by just kind of feeling out, some of the explanations of exactly what therapy is, what life coaching is, and some of those differences. And Deanna, let's start with you, since you're a family therapist. What is like the difference with therapy, and what would someone expect with that?
The difference between therapy and EMDR?
Sure.
Okay. Well, talk therapy is a lot of reprocessing, explaining what they felt, explaining the memory, getting validation, finding safety in that, the release of it, being able to tell somebody that's safe. And it can take a long time to be able to do that. EMDR is an intervention using bilateral stimulation, which we can go into that a little bit more later. Mm-hmm. It's a much quicker intervention. So I once met a therapist, and we were talking about EMDR, and And I had a client that I did 6 sessions with for EMDR, and she's like, wait, what? It took me 2 years to get to the same point that your client did in 6 sessions. So it is a big difference, but it's also very scary for a lot of people.
Right. And Maury, you do life coaching. What would you say would be the difference between therapy and life coaching?
I look at therapy as the why or the what. So why it happened, what happened, and I look at life coaching as the how. How do we overcome it? How can we set goals, and with the shift of a mindset, how can we move past what's happened? And so that's the quickest way I would describe it. It's not certification versus a license. I'm a certified life coach. With therapy, I'm an advocate of therapy. I've done therapy. I still do therapy. And so I look at therapy as more of a diagnosis, as Deanna said, the processes of going through the process. And so with life coaching, it's just kind of overcoming some mental blocks and helping to get through what may have happened, how to live after that, and pick up the pieces of your life. So I would say that's what life coaching is.
Right. And Midori, you have experience in both. So what would you say is kind of the differences between therapy and life coaching, so that maybe somebody can get a little bit of a basis as what might be right for them?
Therapy establishes why you're there. Therapy is, I always like to say, is the playground for self-discovery, because you're trying to figure out some things and you need help in unraveling the mystery, right? Mm-hmm. So it kind of reminds me, there's this bowling alley in Charlotte where they have these rooms called the Great Escape Rooms, and you solve these mysteries. You either have 30 minutes or an hour. Therapy is that same trajectory. Depending on why you're there, you have this certain amount of time to establish why you're there and unravel the mystery. Whereas life coaching, you have a partner to help you jump over the hurdle. How are we going to attack this? How are we going to do this today? Because everything is one day at a time. And I'll speak for myself, in being that I have been diagnosed with complex post-traumatic stress disorder. I tend to take one day at a time as a week. Well, I got to get all this done within a week's time. It's no, you have to do this one day at a time. And in my journey, I've realized that my trauma is making sure that it gets done, because in my mind, getting it done means that it won't pop up again, where that's not necessarily true.
Right. So so one thing may not be right for one person and another thing might not, but it may be a combination of all of those things. I think most survivors find a combination of those things to be the most helpful. But we wanted to specifically talk about EMDR therapy today, because I know there's a lot of controversy around it. Sometimes some people want to stigmatize it, and if it's really beneficial. So, Dana, if you want to go into more detail about EMDR therapy, what exactly it is.
Sure. I can tell you right off, and I have a lot of clients ask me questions like, are you hypnotizing me? I heard that you hypnotize. Or
right.
You can implant memories. And no, there's no hypnotizing. You are aware. You are in control when you do it. I make that very clear to my clients, because survivors, we don't have control. And that's how we got into the situation. So giving control to the client is really, really important for them to hear and understand. EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. We use bilateral stimulation, which is, so it started with this, you follow with your eyes, You can have tactiles, which buzz separately in each hand alternately. You can also do a series of tapping. So it's opposite movement on opposite sides. So that EMDR is definitely a difficult thing to explain, but we have two parts of our brain that are really affected by trauma. So we have our cognitive part of our brain, which is what we're using right now. Then we have our emotional part of our brain. It's the amygdala. That part of our brain is where we end up storing trauma. And the reason we store it there is because we don't want anything to do with it. We can't process it. We can't put ourselves back there. We can't think about it again. So we shove it down there. Unfortunately, it doesn't make it go away. It's just kind of always humming in the background. The emotional part of our brain is not cognitive. So when we get triggered, when we hear a smell, a sound, a saying, a song, we see somebody, we see a specific car, we have a certain memory intrude on our day, we get triggered. When we get triggered, our brain turns off the cognitive processing part of our brain and turns on the emotional. So the emotional part of our brain is irrational and the cognitive part of our brain is rational. So when our emotional brain is triggered, it just responds. It doesn't think about it. It doesn't realize, well, that was like 20 years ago and you're safe now. There's none of that. It's fight, flight, freeze, and also fawn. People are very aware of the fight, flight, freeze. You either fight, you run away, or you freeze out of fear. But fawn is also something that is a trauma response where people are very people pleasing. Like, oh, I'm sorry, it's okay. So they want to stop what's going on, make it okay, because in the past, it meant that they were going to be abused. So that is also a response. When people live with this trauma, they can be triggered and they can be unaware that they're being triggered. So they can respond to something, maybe all of a sudden they get emotional, or maybe they can't concentrate, or maybe they get really irritable and angry and defensive and they don't understand why. Because unfortunately, the trauma that's stored in our emotional part of our brain, we are not always aware what's stored there. Sometimes our brain does this magic that makes us not aware of some of our memories. You know, we might get like little snippets, kind of like a movie. You get a little snippet and it's gone. You focus on it, it disappears, and you know that there's something there, and it leaves you feeling a certain way in your body, and it leaves you feeling a certain way emotionally. So,
absolutely.
Do you have any other questions on EMDR? So I gave you kind of a general
No, that was great. And Midori, what would you add to that as far as what EMDR therapy is or does?
Were you about to finish your question?
Oh, no, I just asked if what you wanted to add to that.
Oh, okay. So pretty much what Deanna described is what it is. I would say that in my case, my therapist used both talk therapy and EMDR to kind of get to the bottom of some things for me, because I had unadulterated rage at the time I was going to see my therapist. I had snapped at a supervisor when I was told I could not go to California to check on my sick grandmother. And my mind was racing. I was thinking to myself, all the work that I put in for this bank, and I can't get the time off that I need to go and see about my grandmother. So not only did I snap on him, I broke my headset. And ironically, my supervisor took it very well. So which also led me to think that he grew up in some type of dysfunction, because it was a rather calm response to my rage. And I realized when I left the building that day, I said I needed help. And I didn't know where my rage stemmed from. So she used a combination of both talk therapy and EMDR to kind of help self-discover why I was the way I was and why it was there for so long.
Right, because that's not the typical response. And all of us survivors have been somewhere in that process where we've had an untypical response and you don't know what to do with it. And so it's wonderful to see that there are things that, you know, we have in common, that when that happens, you're not the only one out there that happens to. Maury, what would you think about, you know, as far as EMDR therapy, and maybe what makes a good candidate for that kind of therapy?
Well, one, I would just first thank you, ladies, because this is opening up a much needed conversation. I myself did EMDR therapy as well. I think a good candidate, I mean, I know that a lot of it was, and Deanna, correct me if I'm wrong, but I know that it was originally formed for PTSD survivors. But anybody who's experienced any type of trauma, suffering, depression, I believe can be a candidate for EMDR. At the time, for me, I think it's a very, very powerful tool. And I actually got a lot from it. Hindsight 2020, though, when I look back at when I did, so I was doing talk therapy, and then my therapist recommended the EMDR for all the stuff that I was going through as a survivor. And while it was very, very beneficial for me, what I recognize now that I would do differently is not, it's a very powerful tool to use post the trauma, post your situation. At the time that I started, I was in shelter. I had just lost my home. I was running from my abuser. I had so many different things going on. My son had some issues with bullying at school. Like it was a lot. And so to already actively, and I was in, let me just say this, I was in 4 different courthouses at once. So I had the domestic violence restraining order hearing. Then I had some other stuff going on, and then I had the criminal protective side for, you know, so I just had a lot of active trauma that was still going on. And so what I found was, you know, while it's very important to get to the root of things, it was kind of like what Deanna talks about, that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. I kind of froze in it because I realized, like, dang, like not only do I have this current present day stuff, but now I got all kind of bleep me out from the past, you know, like it was a lot, but it is a very powerful tool that I later went and revisited. And so hopefully I'm not rambling, but I just wanted to kind of give that life experience for me, even now as a survivor advocate and as a life coach. Like I strongly, strongly recommend it. I think it's a powerful tool because I feel like in order, even in a situation as a survivor, in order not to get back into a situation like this, again, we have to do the work. And that work can be, you know, it's a lifelong thing, but it can be, how would I say, this is a very effective tool. And so I think anybody that, you know, PTSD, anybody that is suffering with anxiety, depression, is a candidate.
Absolutely. And Deanna, I've heard that kind of thing before, what Maury was talking about, from many survivors who start EMDR. They start it and then they quit. And a lot of times I think it is because, from just the people I know and their experience, was that they weren't quite out of all the trauma yet. They weren't ready to experience that. Is that pretty common?
It is common. I mean, EMDR in of itself is kind of a scary thing, you know. Oh, I'm gonna process my trauma. I don't want to think about my trauma. I get the somatic feeling, I get these emotions, I just become very emotional and I can't concentrate. I don't want to do that. I don't want to cry in front of somebody. I can't tell you how many people I see cry, and it's okay to cry in therapy. And there's a saying we therapists have: if we have a client cry in therapy, we've done our job. So with EMDR, you do need to be out. So we have kind of a filing system in our brain. And when we have trauma, it can take 30 to 60 days to actually process whatever that memory is and put it in the right filing drawer. So sometimes something can happen to me and the same thing can happen to you, and I might file it in my emotional brain. It might become a trauma for me, where for you it just becomes a bad experience, a memory. With memories, it's like our filing system is like maybe people, place, experience, emotion, time of our life. Everybody has their own filing system. And when we start to access the emotional brain and the memories in the emotional brain, it's kind of like opening up the cellar, and all these memories kind of waft out. So a lot of times I have people say, whoa, something else came up while I was doing that. And we'll write it down on their timeline. So we keep a timeline so we can make sure that we hit everything. The timeline does not have to be every single memory, because our depending on our filing system, somebody can be doing bilateral stimulation, which activates the emotional and the cognitive brain at the same time, which normally they operate differently. So that's why we can reprocess stuff. When we are doing the bilateral stimulation and that is activated, the memory just kind of does what it needs to do. And it's like, you know what, that's similar. So it kind of brings other things in it. So when I talk about a timeline with my clients, I ask them, what intrudes on you the most? When you're doing the dishes, what kind of memories are intruding? Let's do those. And as things come up, if you can sit with it and just acknowledge that that memory is kind of going through your head while you're doing bilateral, cool. If not, we can stop, we can add it to the timeline. So it is a scary thing, but when you are still in the situation, that trigger is still there. That definitely, it can kind of take the edge off, but it's really hard to do when the trigger's there. And if you are talking about doing EMDR, our brain processes for like 3 days afterwards. So tired, you can feel emotional. Yes. It depends how long of a EMDR session you do. I tend to do like short ones. And I see that my clients don't really have that big of a rebound from it. They might feel a little bit tired. You can kind of feel it in your brain, the left side and right side. You can kind of feel it going back and forth. So they might be a little bit tired and maybe a little emotional the first day, and then it gets better and it gets better. So if they are in a situation that still is not safe, that is going to spark it. It's just like you don't want to do couples therapy with somebody who is abusive to you. That is dangerous. So having some stability, having some coping skills, maybe you need to be on some medication to kind of get you through the process. That is what we want to see. And I did want to speak on what Maury was saying, that you can use it for anxiety and for depression. So a lot of times I call them developmental traumas. It's not always development, but it's when somebody tells you over and over, you're not lovable, you're bad, you are useless, you're not worthy, you're ugly, you're whatever it is. So we have these core belief systems, and that causes us to be insecure, or that causes us to be sad or anxious. And I do EMDR on my clients for those things all the time. And it reprocesses, rewires that memory, and they become feeling a lot more confident about themselves. And in that, they place healthy boundaries, which is really important for anybody, but definitely for survivors. You know, we need to have those healthy boundaries between us and other people. So they
Absolutely.
become more aware, like, I am worth it. I am lovable. I do deserve to be respected. So
Right.
just what Maury was saying, it doesn't have to be PTSD. It doesn't have to be typical violent trauma. It can be emotional trauma. It can be something a teacher said when you were young and it stuck with you, even though they didn't mean to hurt you. So it can be those kind of things.
Wow, that's important information to know. And Maury, when you were experiencing it and going through it, did you feel like there was, any kind of side effects for you, or what maybe benefited you, or which would you rather touch on?
Well, one of the things that Deanna just said about, after you have a session, how you can feel exhausted and tired. I remember the first time I had my first session, and this is, I joke a lot only because that's just my coping mechanism. But I remember leaving the session and I felt so exhausted. I felt just really tired, and I wasn't able, because I was still processing, I didn't really identify at that moment that it was because I had just done some strenuous work in my mind of bringing up old trauma. But I found myself, like, it was like an autopilot. I was in, guilty confession, I was in McDonald's drive-through, and I ordered all of this food, and I just sat in my car and I ate. And I drank and I ate and I drank. And then it was just like, I didn't understand why I was feeling the way I was feeling. And then when I went back to my next session and I told her, my therapist at the time, she said, well, this is, because you activated old memories, your brain just went through a lot. So that I wanted to bring that up.
Yes.
The other thing that you said, what was the question? Sorry. Tend to forget.
No, about if you had any kind of side effects. So basically, you had that
Yes.
response. You had that response that
Yes.
led you to eating, and you had to deal with that. But
I did.
Did you have some others?
Like I said, for me, hindsight was 2020. Like, I realized that I, in the process, it was a very powerful tool, because it did bring up some things. I mean, there was some stuff that I had buried that I really kind of in my mind thought for the longest time, like, did that really happen? But as we started, as Deanna talked about that timeline, as we started going through the timeline, I started realizing, like, oh my gosh, this did really happen. So for that, it was powerful and it was useful. But the side effects, I think, would be just the tiring of it. I would think also I kind of froze because I was actively in my trauma. So it felt like not only do I have this hurricane category 5, 6 that I'm currently in, I felt like now we're adding more stuff to that. But once I was able to, get to a safe place, get to a landing place where I was safe, my environment, I was now not in shelter. I was, rebuilding my life. This was now a tool that I used to help rebuild my life. So to answer your question, I think that the side effect really was just kind of, I wish I had known more knowledge about it, done more research on my own. Sorry. I wish I had done more research on my own before, because then I would have known how to process and know what was exactly that was happening to me.
Right.
I hope I answered that.
No, it's perfect. And so let's go with that. Midori, researching this kind of thing before you begin it, what would you recommend, like, they need to research before they start this kind of therapy from your experience?
See, for me, it wasn't about research. I knew I needed help. So you have to be at a place where you're honest with yourself before you even begin doing any research, because for therapy, what do you research, right? Especially if you're a newcomer, you have to be honest with yourself and knowing that you need help. when the therapist starts talking with you about different options, you also have to be honest with yourself about whether or not you want to go in that direction. And during their evaluation of the initial consultation or the initial visit, they may just say, we'll hold off on that. Or I think I would like to do this with you, but we may have to wait until a certain point. And that's fine as well. So for me, I didn't research anything. I knew I needed help because it was either get help or get fired. Those are the only two options I had.
Right. So it was just imperative for you. You knew
it was
you needed
very
something.
imperative. I snapped at my supervisor. It was in the call center. It was in front of people. I broke a headset that was company property. I either needed to get help or I was going to get fired. It was one or the other. I didn't have time to sit back and research anything. I knew I needed help, pure point blank.
Right. And what about as you were going through the EMDR, did you have anything that would be considered like side effects or something that you had to visit with yourself that you had to?
I slept a lot. I would leave the office and I would go in my car and I would literally take a nap. And then when I woke up, I would go to McDonald's and get a Cinnamelt and coffee. That was my routine every time. And it didn't dawn on me until maybe like the fourth session. Sweets were, and it wasn't like a candy or anything. It was like donuts, cake, my mother making cinnamon toast. Those were comforting. So after every session, I had to comfort myself. So it was Cinnamelts and coffee. I had to have something sweet with a cup of coffee. But that was after my nap. I slept a lot. And I know people would drive by and look at me sitting in the parking lot like, is this child asleep? Yep, I sure was. I was snoring in my car.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Through the Eyes of Survivors. My name is Tara Woodley, and I am the president of Break the Silence Against Domestic Violence, an organization that gives survivors and their families that have lost a loved one to domestic violence access to a community that understands the journey that they're facing. We hope this episode impacts you, whether you're a survivor or a family member, and that you want to learn more about the topic, and that the topics are helping you in some way. If it is, let us know by leaving a review. We love your feedback. Also, make sure to click the subscribe button, and you will get notified of our next episode when it premieres. We hope you enjoyed our podcast. Thank you. Oh man. So Deanna, is that pretty common? Does after you start that type of therapy to a lot of survivors, like or people in general, they try to help soothe what they're going through, I guess is kind of what I'm hearing, by responding to stuff that made them more comfortable. Especially it seems like, it seems like food and sleep, and what other things could there be?
What they're doing is they're coping. They are figuring it feels like a hurricane just kind of went through their brain and stirred everything up, and some things are gone and they feel better. But it's like a lot of work. It's like doing an 8-hour workout session on your body, but you're doing it on your brain. It actually is a lot of work in just a short amount of time. So coping skills, sleeping, it's a coping skill. It's not the worst coping skill, but it can interrupt your life. So we go over coping skills to begin with. We go over stabilization. So one thing that we do is we come up with a happy place or a place of peace or a safe place or whatever you want to call it. And this place is made up. This place does not have any people in it or any of your pets in it, because if something happened in real life, it would kind of blow that place up. So it can be whatever you want. And we want it to be where you can use as many senses as possible. So maybe there's water. You can put your foot in the water. Maybe there's I have like dogs in mind, none of my dogs, but just dogs. And I can pet them. I can play with them. I can read books and I don't have to wear glasses. I can actually read. I can't read. I have astigmatism, so my eyes get blurry really fast. So I can do that in my place. When you go to that place and you try to hear, you try to smell what you would smell, feel what you can feel, and then you do, it's the butterfly hug. So this is a bilateral stimulation. And if you're feeling anxious, if you're feeling emotional, if you're feeling sad, angry, you can close your eyes and you alternately pat on each side of your shoulder, and you go to that place and like really put yourself into that place. So when I do a timeline with someone, we end with that stabilization exercise. When I do EMDR with someone, we end with that stabilization exercise. If I have a client who's not even doing EMDR and maybe they're really upset, we will go through that exercise too, because it's helpful. It's a good coping skill. I have had clients say, oh my gosh, I had this nightmare and I woke up. First thing I did was I grounded and I made sure, yep, that's my lamp. Yes, this is where I am. And then they end up doing this and they go back to sleep. So coping skills are very important. We want to identify what works for you, what your coping skills are before we start EMDR. Because if we leave you without those tools, we don't know what you're going to do. Maybe you're going to go and drink, maybe you're going to be really upset and you're going to do something that's harmful to yourself or harmful to somebody else. Generally, that doesn't happen. But the coping skills are super important before you even start EMDR, and knowledge and researching it. I always explain it the same way. Having them do the research, having them talk to people. I mean, I've had clients that didn't believe in it. Oh, that's bull. I don't think I'm in the mindset, in the space where it's going to help me. But it is scientific. It really does reprocess memories. And I had a client once like that, and we were into one of the memories, and all of a sudden he's like, "Oh my gosh, I felt that feeling leave my body." He says, "I haven't not felt that in 20 years." And he became an EMDR mouthpiece. He told anybody and everybody who would listen about EMDR. And he
that's great.
Did not believe it. So yeah, it really is. It's like my favorite thing to do. Mm-hmm. I specialize in trauma because I love it.
Yes, ma'am. And Midori was saying that she didn't do any research. She just knew. But I know me personally, I'm one of those people that I will research every little dynamic and, aspect of something before I go and do it. So, Deanna, for those who are like me out there, what would you recommend they look for if they're researching EMDR therapy as to what to look for if they want to know, what they're looking for before they get started?
Just Google EMDR. So it started in the 80s. It's one of the most researched interventions out there. So for PTSD, for trauma, you don't have to have PTSD. You don't have to have fought in a war. It could be a car accident. There's a lot of things that you can use EMDR for. Just do a Google search. There is tons of research out there. And remember, there's no hypnotism. We cannot implant a memory. We don't know your memories. You tell us your memories. We don't know what your memories are. And, we measure. So we'll do the EMDR and we'll do the bilateral and we'll measure what is the memory we're working on? What emotion do you feel? On a Likert scale of 0 to 10, with 10 being the worst, where is it on that scale? And where do you feel it in your body? And people are like, wait, what? And then they scan their body. They're like, oh, I do feel it. And here's where I feel it. And there's no one place anybody feels it. Some people feel it in their left calf, and that's fine. And it's not weird. And I just want to say to anybody who's thinking about EMDR, we're never going to judge your trauma, and we don't want you to judge your trauma. If it is a memory that brings up a bad emotion and you can feel it in your body, that's EMDR worthy. It doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter how insignificant cognitively we feel like it is, because emotionally it's stored in our emotional part of our brain. That is EMDR worthy. I don't care what it is. So I just wanted to plug that, because a lot of people don't understand that.
No, absolutely. I definitely understand the whole concept of, and people don't realize this, that they carry their trauma in parts of their body. It affects them in parts of their body. And how you really don't realize it until it hits you full force in that part of your body. And then that's what that is. So Maury, did you have a experience like that you would like to share, where that it was affecting parts of your body, that it was helpful?
Yeah, I the first thing I thought of as Deanna was talking is the body, the book, the body keeps the score. Our
Yes.
body really does keep a score. And to even piggyback off of what Midori said about, like, for me, I was in so much pain, physically, mentally, emotionally, that I needed help. So when my therapist recommended, I didn't have time to research. So when I say hindsight is 2020, I wish I had researched, but at the same time, it's what I needed in that moment. And so I just went with it. And I'm glad that I did, because it introduced me to something that I believe that for us, in order for us to heal holistically, we do have to we have to dig deep. And that digging deep sometimes is painful. I heard somebody say one time that healing can be more painful than what you actually went through. And it's true, but it's necessary to do the work. And I'm so passionate about healing and so passionate about recovering from what we may have gone through, that it's a necessary evil. Like we have to do the work. So for me, that pain was so deep enough and so heavy enough that I wanted to do the work. And so if that meant revisiting old things to get it up and get it out, because I'm big about that. Like me and my kids, we have what we call healing conversations, because if you stuff it down, it doesn't do anything. It does affect your body. And so, like, even for me, to answer your question, I had a miscarriage. I had gallbladder issues. I had a hysterectomy. Like, I'm just being completely transparent. My body, from the trauma and the stress that I went through for years, it took a toll. It really did. And so, the fact that I'm here today and I'm recovered and still recovering, because healing is lifelong, but able to be in the fight with someone else to help other survivors is it's important. And I believe it's a necessary tool. I'm a fan of EMDR. I thank God that I was introduced to it. And even after I did do the research, I was even more sold on it. And so I would just say for anyone to really make sure that, if you have time to do the research, but it's more important about getting with a therapist that is licensed to do it, because people can throw words around and say, hey, I do this, but making sure they've actually been trained in it, like Deanna, to where they know, because it is a lot, and it is a lot that will come up and that you could possibly go through and be triggered by. And so you want to be in a safe space with someone who knows, like she said, introducing the coping skills. Like, I love that. That's one of the things we did, the safe place. In my mind, I was on a beach somewhere with crystal blue water and white sand, and the sun was shining on my face. And that's what helped ground me and bring me back to, hey, this isn't happening right now. This is, you're not what you've gone through. It happened, but that's not who you are now.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you're not alone, girl. I'll tell you that, because I know that my body, I had to have a hysterectomy. I lost my gallbladder. It was all trauma induced. My body kept that score. What about you, Midori? How is the trauma, manifested itself in your body?
Well, during the process of that time period of being in therapy, I had just had a major car accident. So I had a sciatic nerve that I was just healing from, which was very painful. I also was just diagnosed as having inherited a condition called lymphedema. So I was walking around with a lot of fluid in my body, not knowing why. And it was very annoying at that time in my life because I had gone to 8 different doctors. And during that process, I learned that I was diabetic and I had high blood pressure. My primary care doctor would not examine me for some reason. And I believe it was because I was Black. She was a white doctor. She wasn't comfortable with me. And of course, in my rage, I politely told her what she could do with her office and her license. Because I'm walking around in pain. I'm paying you the co-pays and you're not giving me any diagnosis. So I flipped her the bird in the office as well, and her staff. Again, I'm very surprised that they didn't call the police on me because I was irate. I was enraged. So when I was dealing with all of this in therapy, it was my lower back and my legs where I carried all of my trauma, because that was, I was walking to different doctors. I was catching the bus, going to these different hospitals. And by the time I got to seeing a therapist, it was my aunt who lent me her car and said, go get the help you need. Because one thing I can say is that I'm proud of you for even admitting that you need it. It takes courage to say, I need to stop and figure out who the hell I am and where I am in this life. And I needed to figure it out because it was really daunting. So I carried it in my lower back and hips, and especially my legs. I mean, I felt like I was carrying so much dead weight, but that was trauma because my trauma began in those spaces at the age of 4. So I carried that. And here I am at 45 dealing with rage.
Right. Yeah.
And not being heard. And I think that was the stimulus of my rage, because I felt like I was having temper tantrums because no one would hear me. Even when I was in school, my name Midori is Japanese, but I'm Black. So teachers would overlook me because they were looking for a little Asian girl, not a little Black girl with Afro puffs. So I had to stand up and yell, I'm here. My name is Midori.
So with your EMDR, you were experiencing a lot of rage. So how did it help you deal with the rage you were feeling inside?
For once, it had a name. I didn't know what to call it. Black women are always stigmatized as being these angry Black, for lack of a better term, bitches. So now there's a professional name. There's an actual term. I learned through my rage that it was post-traumatic stress disorder. And then after going through more sessions, and even recently, just to confirm that, what this first therapist did was actually correct. I was diagnosed as having complex post-traumatic stress disorder because my trauma never stopped. My trauma never stopped. I was, at 4, I was molested. Then I was beaten by strangers at 8, and then my mother disappears at 14. I was raped at 15. I mean, it never stopped. Never. So when you don't have the resources or the kind of supportive support system that you need to discuss these things. Because my father was a single parent. He had to work. He worked two jobs. So there was no time for these conversations. So here I am at 45 having to carve out time to see why I'm so angry. And then in going through all that uncovering and unearthing, it was like, yeah, I see why now my hips hurt, my lower back hurts. I've walked so slow because not only of the condition that I inherited, but I inherited a lot of generational weight.
Right. Wow. Yeah. So, Deanna, when she basically what I just heard Midori talking about is this timeline. Isn't this what you were talking about, helping to establish these timelines and these memories and being able to access them and deal with them? So this is pretty standard as to what happens in therapy when you're doing that, correct? That's a good example of it, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what we do. And that's painful for a lot of people too. With my clients, sometimes they don't want to tell me what the memory is. Maybe they're embarrassed. Maybe they feel shame. Maybe they feel guilt. Maybe it's something that they feel they did to bring this trauma onto themselves. And I don't push them for those memories. I say, it's fine.
Right.
Tell me how old you were. Give me a couple of words that's going to bring you back to this memory. And that's good. We can do it on that. I don't have to know all the details, which is something that is really amazing about EMDR. Sometimes people don't remember all the details of a memory and they're like, can I do it? Absolutely. So, whatever it is you remember about that time, and sometimes it can be fleeting, like you can kind of lean toward it and it just kind of disappears. Your brain's kind of protecting you from it, but you have this emotion and you have this somatic feeling in your body. We can do it on that. And maybe you'll remember it and maybe you won't. And it's okay if you don't. So, and I just want to kind of touch base back on, the body keeps score. I also had a gallbladder removed and I also had a hysterectomy. So we all three kind of went through that thing.
Yes.
And then
I also miscarried. That was another thing that was unearthed because I buried that deep into my consciousness. My miscarriage. That was very painful because it didn't even make it to be a whole fetus. So I lost a lot of blood.
Maury was talking about how you really have to go through it and it's really difficult.
Yes.
Imagine it like you break a bone. You have that bone set, you go to the doctor, you have a cast on it, you lose all of that muscle and the ability to use your bone, your leg, your arm, your appendage, whatever it is, the way that you're supposed to. So you have to do physical therapy. And physical therapy is hard and it takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of appointments and you get really sore, but it makes you strong. EMDR, very much the same way.
Absolutely.
I love that.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. So, if you had to give somebody like some tips before they started this therapy from your experience, Maury, what would you tell somebody if they said like I think I'm interested in doing EMDR? What advice would you give them?
I'm a big journaler, so I would suggest journaling, like for whatever you might be experiencing or feeling after the session, you can journal. And I have a lot of people that say, oh, well, I don't like to write. I'm not a big journaler. Well, we all have cell phones and there's a voice memo on your cell phone and you can record yourself just to get it up and out and to process. Because I feel like there's a process to the process. So the EMDR is one process. And then after a session, you've got to process that process. So that would be my suggestion, is to journal and to make sure, like I do daily gratitude and affirmations, like for what you pull up in the trauma and the things that are unfair and shouldn't have happened, but they did, you want to make sure that you pour back into yourself and have grace with yourself. So it's very important to do a daily gratitude list, a daily affirmation, and just like Deanna was talking about the butterfly pose, like, but give yourself a hug, like love yourself, know that you're worthy, know that this is a very necessary process to go through to get it up and to get it out, but that you still have an outlet in terms of journaling or just the affirmations and the gratitude journal is I would say the three biggest things is just to make sure that you are pouring for the toxins that you're taking out, make sure you're putting the good probiotics back in, right? And so when you think about we need the probiotics in our system, like that's what I would say, like the affirmations, the journaling, the speaking kind words over yourself, really showing grace to yourself and loving on yourself and learning what that process is, because a lot of people don't know what that looks like either, what love means. But love is taking care of yourself. Love is doing the work. Love is getting help and speaking life and truth over yourself.
Right. So adding to that, then it's probably, I'm hearing that it's essential to have a good self-care routine
absolutely.
along with it.
Absolutely.
Midori, you want to touch on some of that? What kind of tips would you give, or self-care things that you felt beneficial for you?
To thine own self be true. You have to have some knowledge of yourself in order to take care of yourself. So definitely have a self-care regimen, but also be in tune, be in the moment with you so that you can do that. When you're coming from out of EMDR, you cannot escape from that moment, from that exercise, from that therapy. So deep breathe, ground yourself, and then know what it is that makes you feel better. I know for me, after I finally made it to my grandmother's house, and it was 3 years since she passed, I would make a cup of chamomile tea, just like I used to make for her and myself. And I would go in her room and shut the door and just drink tea in silence because I wanted to have a conversation with her. She was my rock when I was escaping my abuser, and her wisdom and her love and grace got me through so much of it. So in the spirit, I wanted to connect to her. So that is what I would do after therapy, after I took my nap, after I got my coffee and my cinnamon. I would make chamomile tea and I would go in her room and I would sit.
Right.
And just connect with her in the spirit, just to hear her. That's what calmed me down.
Absolutely. And Deanna, what would you say as far as, tips for people just before they get started or as they are getting started with EMDR?
We always want to make sure that they meet criteria for EMDR. Are they in a safe place? Do they have coping skills? After EMDR, is there somebody that they can go for support if they need it? Maybe just sit with somebody in silence, maybe play a game with them, watch funny videos, something that they can feel good about. The coping skills is one of the biggest things. And I mean, I would share with people that you trust that you're going through EMDR, but I've had clients who didn't have anyone they trust. And their own children says, oh, you're happy, mommy. They notice the difference. The coworkers are like, wow, you're different. What's going on? And they don't know it. It's amazing how people who don't even know what they're going through notice the difference of them after they've gone through it.
And that is the God honest truth, Deanna, because I just had a sorority sister go through EMDR, and her daughter, who's 4, prior to her mother going into the hospital, Jasmine spoke in baby language. Like, I want huggies, I want mommies. And while she was there, Jasmine would call her mother and say, "Mommy, we miss you. When are you coming home? I want to give you a hug." And I said, that child knew you were going through something, that she needed to be a voice to speak to you to continue your journey. That's amazing. This little girl's only 4.
Right.
Only 4.
Yeah, children sense things that you don't even have a clue the things they sense and they know.
Yeah, because it touched my sorority sister so much so. She was crying to me, describing the experience. And she said when she got home, Jasmine came up to her and said, "Mommy, you look so much better. We're so happy to have you home." She said, "My daughter is speaking in full sentences. She didn't do that before I left."
Oh, wow.
And I said, "Oh, that's amazing."
Yeah. That is amazing. And Maury, when you did it, did you have children when you were doing that? So can you speak some to the differences maybe your children was seeing in you?
That I was a lot calmer, because I had a lot of anxiety because, again, there was so much going on. And just to back up, when I say like I was in 4 active cases at one time, that was all due to my ex losing my house. I had going against in divorce court, then the criminal protective order, the city in which we lived in, they had taken up a case against him because of the abuse. Like, it was a lot. And I think, I know from the process, like my kids are 14 years apart. So my oldest, which is my daughter at the time, she definitely noticed and was like, "Mom, how," and so I ended up giving her the therapist information, and she ended up going on her own just because she saw the effects that it was having on me. So she went and she was like, "Mom, how do I get involved? Like, how do I do this?" And so I set her up with the therapist, and she started doing EMDR as well. And she saw the benefit of it as well.
Awesome. So you got to, set the example for your daughter for that journey of healing.
Yeah.
That's powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah. And does that happen quite often, Deanna, that the family, it cascades into that kind of an effect?
Yes, because you can tell people all day long, you need EMDR, you need therapy, you need this, you need that, and it's just words. But when you see this transformation in somebody that you love, a lot of times, like siblings, friends who have gone through something together, they're like, "Oh, I want what you have. How can I get that?" It is the biggest voice without a voice is seeing somebody's whole self and behavior and anxiety and anger and lack of concentration change to somebody who is calm, who can communicate.
Wow, that's powerful. And Midori, with your family, what kind of differences did they notice afterwards?
I think with my family, especially my aunt, because she deals with issues of codependency, it made her realize that, there may be some things she has to look at as well for herself. So I kind of became an inspiration to her, and that she needed to examine some things within herself, within her habits and addictions and her codependency.
Yeah, so that's phenomenal that we're able to help fix, generations, even our upper generations, help them come to realize the help that we kind of need. Because most of the times this kind of thing is definitely, most people, it's generational. And so it's overcoming generations of trauma, not just your own trauma.
Well, it's a radical acceptance of that.
Yeah.
And that's what when I look at EMDR therapy, it teaches you radical acceptance.
Yeah.
Not only about yourself, but where you are. Because in order to heal from it, you got to embrace it. And that was the problem that I had for years. I mean, especially, again, my trauma never stopped. I mean, even after I was raped at 19, I was sexually assaulted by a family member, and that drove me to drink because I had never heard of incest before until it happened to me. So a therapist then in college told me radical acceptance. You have to embrace it in order to heal from it.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what EMDR does. It is it's a format that brings about radical acceptance.
Can I add to that, Tara? Thank you for
Yes.
saying that, Midori, because in my journey, that's how I became a life coach. That's how I became an author, because I wrote about my experience. Because just to Midori's point, like, I believe that this was a very instrumental tool, because in having to go, in order to change the trajectory of my family, didn't want my children to go through what I had gone through. It was a big eye opener, though, because in the process, I realized that I wasn't the first person to have gone through domestic violence, right? And so when I started looking at kind of the history of my family, it was mind blowing, but it was because of this therapy, because now I have to dig and I have to look with a special lens, right? And so to your point, like, you become, in a sense, an inspiration to some of your family, but on the other side, it's kind of like going into a dark house with a flashlight. Some people are like, "Hey, don't come over here with all that light," you know, like, don't come over
right.
here.
Closet door
We're good,
you know. Come out, because the
Yeah.
Rockettes kept all the secrets.
Exactly.
So you're an enemy to some. Absolutely.
Yes. An enemy to change, right? And so, and an enemy to healing. And so I think that's a very good point that Midori brought up. Like, it does help you to look at for me, it looked at the big picture. And that's why I became an advocate, because it was like, okay, this has got to stop with me. And this can't keep going on. And because I didn't know what I was going through and what I got, like, I didn't recognize, I wasn't self-aware. Now it's giving me a greater passion to say, okay, you know what? Let me help the next person, and all the things that I did to be where I am today and still actively healing, right? But let me be a light and a voice for somebody else, and help them, so maybe they don't have to go through some of the things that I went through, or they can, as Deanna said, with EMDR versus talk therapy, like, we can get to the root within 6 sessions versus a year and a half of therapy. Like, we can speed this thing up so that we can start healing in an effective way. And I think that's what EMDR is.
I would like to kind of add to that too, the radical acceptance. When you process a memory from the emotional part of your brain to your cognitive part of your brain, when it's in the irrational part of your brain, you don't have any control over it. When it's in the cognitive part of your brain, it doesn't erase the memory from you. You remember what happened, you remember what you felt, you remember how it affected you, but it becomes a memory. So maybe something comes across and it makes you think of that memory, and you can acknowledge, oh yeah, that happened.
Yeah.
Wow, I'm glad I'm at this point now, and you move on. So you have more control over those memories. You still could get a trigger, but the trigger acts differently. You respond differently to the trigger. Instead of responding fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, you're like, whoa, you know what? Just like 3 months ago, that would have had me down for the count,
Right.
So it feels like radical acceptance when it goes from one part of your brain to the other. Yeah, that happened. And here I am today, and I am a survivor. I'm not a victim. I'm a survivor, and I'm moving forward.
And I'm also strong enough to have the conversation. One of the things that was uncovered when we dealt with my abuse from a family member, it was my mother's baby brother. And in talking to him about the memory, because he was going through rehab at the time, he was dealing with memories of that as well. And he apologized to me, which was rare. Normally, your perpetrator does not apologize to you. So I had the strength to have the conversation with him. And I learned that he was abused at 9 years old by my grandmother, which I thought I would have passed out if he had told me that about 5 months earlier. But to be that mirror and allow him to share that with me, I realized in the moment that it was a human moment, you know, and it was, you know, for him to admit that was it was a miraculous moment, because it explained to me so many aspects of his behavior growing up, why he was on cocaine, why he was like into prostitution, you know, like he pimped girls. And it was because of his anger of being abused that he beat himself up for years, to the point of hurting himself, to the point of putting himself in harm's way, stealing from family, you know? So we both had what I would call a come to Jesus moment, and where we both wept because we were carrying generational trauma.
Yes. Yeah. And it's cathartic. It is definitely cathartic.
It was definitely cathartic. And today we're extremely close because of it, because we both had to go through a radical transformation to get to that point of why.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Tara, I just want to say this really quickly to what Deanna, Deanna, you're so good. And so I just really appreciate this space and this moment, because one thing that comes up too about why it's so important, why EMDR is such a powerful tool, is because when we go through things in our childhood, like sexual abuse or things like that, right? Those things happen in that moment. We don't know how to necessarily process it, right? And so now when we're going through this EMDR and we're sitting with this and we're bringing this up and we're recognizing where it is in our body, like it's a time where we're actually getting to actually acknowledge that this happened and go through like the process of like, wow, I suppressed this and this really did happen. And now I get in this moment, get to process what I didn't know how to process as a kid or as a teenager. So thank you for that, because that just really a light bulb just went off in for me with that. So
it's very empowering.
Yes.
You get to take your power back.
Yes.
You get to take these memories and these thoughts that you have been haunted by for so long that would ruin your entire day, and just sit there and acknowledge them.
Right.
You know what? I had a right to feel like that. I no longer feel like that.
Yeah.
You know, and you still may have emotion. You can have emotion, you know, in your cognitive brain too, but you are in control of it. You can address it. You can move on from it. You can give yourself a safe space to just say, yeah, you know what? No wonder I was afraid. I have a right to be afraid. I'm no longer afraid. And you move on. So, yeah, you are very welcome.
Wow, that's powerful. Take your power back, ladies.
Yes.
Anyone
well,
out
that's
there,
really what it's about, reclaiming your time.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, we lost her, but
Midori.
that's all right. So I think that's a good place to end it. So definitely everyone check out some therapy and life coaching sessions around you and see if EMDR is available. And if it's right for you, then absolutely do it, and just shed a light and take your power back. Right. So, and if you're ever in a situation out there that you need some help, then and you need someone to talk to, BTSADV has our support line. That number is 1-855-287-1777. The support line is available for resources. And if you're actually in a crisis, then please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline. We thank you for being a part of our podcast today. And please check out our webpage, breakthesilencedv.org. We have a lot of resources there, a lot of programs. Feel free to check out our programs, possibly donate. All funds go to help victims of domestic violence. So thank you.